The tremendous crowds which you see gathered outside the stock exchange are due to the greatest crash in the history of the New York Stock Exchange in market prices.
Dear Dave, I was only about 10 or 12 years old when the Depression was so bad, but I can tell you some of the things that I remember so well. My daddy was a man that could do a lot of jobs. He could not find work anywhere. He could paint, build, cement, rock mason, and run all kinds of machinery, such as steam shovel, engineer on railroad, just about anything, he could do it. But he couldn't find a job anywhere. My sister Willie had a job in the mill, but she only made about 25 cents an hour and was working 4 or 5 days a week, so that kept us bread. We lived in a house that the mill company owned, and she paid a rent of about $6 a month. I know when I was going to school, I only had one pair of shoes, and they got a hole in the bottom, and I cut a cardboard and put it in my shoe so my foot wouldn't touch the ground. They used to make half soles for shoes that you could stick on the bottom, and when my daddy got a hold of a dime, he put them on my shoes. They cost only a dime. We had a cow, and that kept us milk and butter. We sure did eat a lot of gravy and bread. My mama would try to have a garden in the summer, and that helped us out too. We didn't have a car. Not many people did. All of this happened when Herbert Hoover was president. People everywhere were just doing the best they could. They didn't have anything much. Banks everywhere went busted, and the people that had a little money lost it. The Depression was over when me and Wilton got married in 1938, but we still had a hard time. The election time came, and President Roosevelt got elected, and he started up a lot of government jobs, called WPA. He also gave out food, such as flour and meal, sugar, and that kind of thing. My daddy got a job as a foreman over a crew of men that worked on roads and bridges under WPA. That helped us a lot. He didn't make much money, but it was a big help. After about a year under the new president, things began to pick up, but slowly. But as long as I live, I'll never forget President Roosevelt, because he was the president that brought us out of the Depression.
The stock market collapsed. America had been on something of a spending spree in the 1920s. Many people had started to play the stock market. There weren't the kind of protections in place that we have today. And the stock market collapsed, and it set off not only American but a worldwide depression that lasted in some places over 10 years.
Well, I was born in January of 1931, and so I've often told people that I have a depression mentality. I'm not depressed. I just remember the Depression, and one of our favorite things was save paper, save string, save everything. And we really did, and reused everything. We didn't know the word recycle back then, but everything was recycled. And if you had leftover mashed potatoes, then you had potato pancakes the next day. We never threw a morsel of food away that I can remember.
The sugar was rationed, and I can't remember what else. I'm sure gas was rationed back then too. But the sugar was rationed, and my mother and my cousins, my relatives, they would all get together and bake cakes at Christmas and share their sugar and what they had, to offer.
Women went into the workplace. I think the percentage of married women in the workplace went up to like 30% during the Great Depression. Those are not exact statistics, but it definitely rose dramatically. And at the same time as these married women are going into the workplace, what they're being told is, you're a bad person. You're taking a job from a man. You shouldn't be working. You're taking food out of somebody else's mouth. And you say, well, but I'm doing it for my children. But people are still looking at you like, you bad woman. Because the belief was that when women worked, especially married women, they were only working for what was called pin money. P-I-N, pin money, like pins to put your hair up or pin your dress with or whatever. Meaning it's for foolish, silly things, like if you had a job just to work to, buy music with or something. And so there's a lot of propaganda, a lot of articles in the newspaper, things saying, you women shouldn't work, but women have to work.
My father was a printer, and he was not didn't work on the newspaper. He worked actually at the Baptist Courier at one time too, and so he managed to keep a job, and we were never homeless, and we were never really hungry. But I was really, they used to worry about me because I was such a skinny kid. I'm not anymore, but
both of them were mill workers, and one of my cousins later told me, I always thought they had more money than us, but she told me just a couple of years ago that they always thought that we had more money than they did because both the parents were working, 2 incomes. And my mother was very, very frugal and would not spend money for anything that wasn't necessary, And my dad had a garden, of course, every year, and in the summertime raised all of our vegetables.
he was working on the Florence Morning News, and he had worked that night. So when they came to tell when it happened, and then back then, of course, all we had was radio, but we didn't have a telephone, and so he had come home and gone to bed because he'd worked the night before. It was a morning paper. And he came. They came and got him. They got him back up, so they could go and print a special edition.
For a vast majority of middle-class Americans, what the Great Depression did for them personally was it destroyed the American dream. It took away this idea that as long as you worked hard, saved your money, were a good person, that you'd be okay and your life would be better and you'd have something to leave for your children. And all of a sudden, overnight in many cases, entire life savings are wiped away. And what that does, I think, is it destroyed many Americans emotionally. They had a hard time with trust after this.
I don't think they lost any to amount to anything, because if you want to know the truth about it, I don't think they really had it before the Depression. Daddy was just a working man,
My mother went to work when she was 16 in the mill, and she had a savings account. And when they had when the Depression started, when the banks all went busted, she lost all of her money that she had saved, and she was afraid of banks from then on. She was always afraid, but she did have an account later in her life and went back to banking.
Really didn't recognize it too much. I mean, we went on just like a daily life, but you could tell that there were times that things were bad. There were times. We didn't have it smooth all the time.
There's so many multiple layers of tragedy about the Great Depression and the way it affected people, and then the way they would talk to their children about money.
Well, I think we probably had better care because of they were so frugal, and they didn't have a lot of debt, and they didn't have we didn't always owe people, and we lived very simply, and I think it contributed to my life in some ways. I mean, it would have been nice, I guess, to have, better, nicer things, but it made me aware of value of things. And
Greenville had trolley cars, and Daddy would take me for a ride around the belt on the trolley. And at one time, we lived here, and Grandma lived over here somewhere, Grandma and Grandpa. And we would stop off at Grandma and Grandpa's, and she always made biscuits. And so she'd take a biscuit and punch a hole down in it and pour syrup or molasses or honey in it. And that would be my treat for going to see Grandma. Back then there was penny candy. And so sometimes when we would go to if Mother lugged me to the grocery store, that I would be able, but I got 1 penny. You know, just one treat, just one little piece of candy. And now, of course, kids have bags of them and ruin their teeth by eating so many sweets and stuff.
I used to go to the store back when I was in high school, no, when I was in grammar school, and Baby Ruth would be 5 cents.
I will never forget her telling me that they ate well during the Depression because not only did they have livestock, her father was a good hunter. And she's always talked about how good squirrel was. And I'm like, squirrel? And she's like, squirrel is really tasty. And she described to me how you skin a squirrel.
As I said, we never went hungry, but there was a lot of times that we didn't have what I wanted to eat. I guess we ate a lot of beans and cornbread, and we all liked cornbread. And
apparently my great-grandfather also had a very large rifle and with a very heavy caliber bullet. And he would go fishing with his rifle. Basically, he would just find a place where there was a school of fish, poof, fire into the water. The percussion either stuns or kills the fish. They float to the top. He picks them all up. The family has a good meal.
I always considered us very poor, but evidently we weren't as poor as I thought.
I remember my grandparents talking about, this is a little bit later during the war, when things were rationed and you would have coupons that you could only get like 1 pair of shoes a year, or you could only get so much meat, etc. That they would trade coupons with people, so that, for example, my grandmother wanted her kids to have shoes. So she would trade shoe coupons for sugar or something else with other families to make sure her kids had shoes, and there were other things that they could either manufacture at home or just do without.
I got a bicycle the Christmas that I would have been 12 next January. My first bicycle, and that was all I got for Christmas. And I can remember we had stockings, and we'd have an orange and an apple and some candy in it, and we got the stocking. And I know one year I wanted really wanted a red cardigan sweater, and I was probably 9 or 10 then. And that was it. I got Santa Claus brought me a red cardigan sweater, but we didn't get a lot of anything. And but you know what? We survived, and I think I'm a whole lot better person for it. I hope I'm not tight, but I'm still kind of careful with my money because we grew up that way.
All right. Well, my mom was born in 1918, so she was a teenager during the Depression, and a young woman, a teenager and a young woman. And there's several things I can remember that she told me about the Depression. One thing that she always said was that it really was not so bad being poor because everybody was poor. Nobody had any money, and so you didn't feel bad about being poor because you were just in the same boat as everyone else. Her mom made all her clothes and that sort of thing, and lots of relatives moved into the house with them. So my mother slept in the same bed with my grandmother, and her sister, my mother's sister, my aunt, slept in the same bed with her grandmother, my great-grandmother, and everybody had to double up, but that was okay too. That's just what people did. One story I remember in particular, she told about going to the beach every summer to Polly's Island with Zadie Brawley. Now, Zadie Brawley must have been an interesting woman. I never knew her. I knew her daughter. But Zadie lived in the house that is now the Poinsett Club in Greenville. So it was a fabulous mansion, really. It's not as big as it is now, but still, even in those days, it was a big, beautiful house, I think. So this was a well-to-do family, but of course, when the Depression hit, they didn't have a lot of money. But Zadie took a bunch of little girls to her beach house on Polly's Island every summer. And I think she just did this kind of out of the kindness of her heart. I mean, she just thought that maybe they were even underprivileged children, I don't know, but she thought that they needed this experience of going to the beach. So she would have camp at the beach. And she hired my mother as one of the camp counselors. And so my mother would be in charge of a whole bunch of little girls, I think it was little girls probably, anyway, little children. And she would tell stories about, holding hands on each side with a little tiny child, and they were holding hands. She'd have like 7 children on each side of her, and they'd walk out into the ocean. It horrified her after she was grown, thinking about how young she was and being in charge of all these tiny little children in the ocean. But anyway, at the end of the week or 2 weeks or however long the camp was, Zadie would want to pay my mother for being a counselor, and she didn't have any cash to pay her with. So she would pay my mother and any of the other counselors by giving them a silver spoon from her own collection, a sterling silver spoon. And we still have some beautiful sterling silver spoons. In fact, I have 2 of Zadie's spoons that she gave to my mother in camp.
I just don't believe that the children of today could make it like we did years ago, because you're not used to hard times. You're not climatized enough to do it.
I don't think any of us know our strength until we are called upon to make sacrifices. I don't think any of us know how strong we could be until that moment comes. You talked about a proverb that said, when something bad comes along, don't ask God for a lesser burden, ask God for bigger shoulders to carry that burden. I don't think, again, any of us know until that day comes. But I think that's one reason why we study history. It's one reason we look back and we see, how did people react when they were challenged? What forces did they draw upon? How did they learn to make do? What sort of changes did it lead to? The Great Depression led to changes in our banking system to try to protect people. It led to the Social Security Act that all of you are familiar with. So I keep circling around to, we don't know, but I don't think, there's one thing that sort of bothers me. There's that term, the greatest generation. Maybe you all are familiar with that, basically applying to everybody in World War II. And certainly that was a great generation. But if we were called upon, I think we might find that you would be the greatest generation too.